was so anticlimactic. Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. I don't see anyone talking about this book. I didn't like it. This was a freaking delight. There's no way this could be real. Oh, I just really hated Bunny. Whew, yeah, I would die for them. The most disturbing book I have ever read. Hi, I'm Sam. There's quite literally no one asking me to do this, but I would like to tell you about all of the books that I read in May and June. Now, if you're thinking, Jesus, Sam, you look like a rodeo clown that got punched in both eyes, you would be correct. And that's because I listened to my intrusive thoughts and decided to wear blue eyeshadow today. A shade of color I almost never wear. And as such, I now look like I have two black eyes. Not to sound like the most unoriginal Taurus ever, but this is why we don't try new things, okay? But anyway, let's talk about the books that I read in May and June. In total, between the 2 months, I read 22 books, so let's talk about them. The first book I read was for book club, and I finished it on the day we had book clubs, but that was Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and this was pretty much just Neil Gaiman's retelling of a bunch of Norse myths, which I'm familiar with a few of, so a lot of it wasn't super new to me, but it did read very YA. It was an easy read, pretty inconsequential. You know, book club really didn't have much to say about it. I mean, I don't think anyone hated it, but it was fine. You know, if you're interested in learning more about Norse myths, maybe check it out. And then the second book that I read was the third Orochi Perfect Edition by Kazuo Umezu. The Orochi series is really hit or miss for me. It's either I really like the stories or they're pretty just like, eh. I think this volume was pretty good. It's weird. I think the first volume is the one I liked the least, and you would think that they would kind of start out with kind of their best stories in the first volume to get people hooked on the series and to get people to buy the subsequent volumes. But I would say if you read the first volume and you didn't love it, maybe give the second and or third a chance. They're unconnected short stories, so you don't really have to read them in a specific order. They were pretty good. Kazuo Umezu is obviously a classic horror manga artist, so I'm happy to be reading more of his work and, you know, getting to know more horror manga artists besides Junji Ito. Next, I listened to a short story because I think I was on a road trip somewhere. I was on like a long drive, and I like to pick out audiobooks where I can finish it in the drive. So that was The Cabin by Brian Evenson. And Brian Evenson is a horror author that I've been really interested in reading. I've never read anything of his before, but all the little excerpts of things that I've read of his always sound so good, and his writing style seems like something I would really enjoy. So this short story was about a man who is up in the mountains at this very isolated cabin, and it's winter. Very immediately, it is impressed upon the reader how treacherous this landscape is. This man is going around to check his traps, and it's made very clear that if he doesn't get back before dark, he could pretty much die. And as he's checking his traps, he starts to feel like he's maybe getting lost, which is weird because he kind of like feels like he knows these woods like the back of his hand. So it's really strange. The sun's starting to set, and then he just gets really, really turned around. From there, things just keep getting from bad to worse. He ends up becoming injured, and then finally, while he's trudging through the snow, he stumbles upon this cabin, and what he sees as a potential savior ends up being maybe not so much of a savior. That was so anticlimactic. But yeah, I obviously don't want to give too much away because it is a short story, but I really enjoyed Brian Evenson's writing style. You know, this wasn't like a 5-star banger for me, but I'm also just not a short story girly. So I'm really interested in more of his long form work because that's where I think writers really shine, and that's kind of my cup of tea. But if you like short stories and you like horror, definitely check out The Cabin by Brian Evenson. Next, I read a sci-fi book, which might surprise a lot of you because I don't typically read a lot of sci-fi, but one of my favorite movies is Sunshine, which is, it's sci-fi, but it's sci-fi horror. So it has to have some horror elements for me to be interested, and that's why I read this book, Do You Dream of Terra 2 by Temi O. This is very far in the future. Earth is dying, and they have discovered this Earth-like planet many, many light years away or whatever. They recruit these kids to basically train to become the crew that will fly to this new Earth-like planet that they call Terra 2. And the journey to get there will basically take like 20 or 25 years. So that's why they want to train kids basically starting from when they're like 12, 13, send them out when they're like 18, 19, so that once they get there, they still kind of have quite a bit of life to live, so they can settle Terra 2 and build up the society there before they send more and more people. So we're following this crew of, they're like 18. So this read very young adult, which I guess maybe the ages of the characters should have been a hint to me, but there also are older characters. I wanted this to be more like space horror, but this was more so, it was like a young adult drama set in space, basically, which is fine. Like, I'm fine with character development and a character-driven story, but it was kind of just like not very interesting to me. You know, these kids are supposed to be like the 5 best, smartest people of their generation. They trained and they were selected out of like hundreds or thousands of people because of how talented they were in their respective departments. So then for them to get onto the ship and act how they were acting, part of me is like, but they're kids, and then another part of me is like, how is this person one of the best of the generation? You know, it made me lose my faith in humanity if this is the best. I overall was pretty underwhelmed. If this had been with an adult cast, written in a more adult tone, ramp up the horror elements, I would have liked this a lot more. Okay, next I read Goodnight Punpun by Inio Asano. This is a really beloved series in the manga community, and I have previously really enjoyed Inio Asano's work. Nijigahara Holograph was in my best books of 2022, so I was really looking forward to this, but I kind of left this feeling sort of underwhelmed. Our main character is this middle school boy named Punpun, and he's drawn as this bird-like creature, and his art style is very different from the art style of the other characters. The other characters look more humanoid and, you know, have more details. Punpun is like this very two-dimensional, kind of crude drawing of a bird, so it's definitely humorous in that respect. Inio Asano always plays with form and art style as part of driving his story, so I definitely see Inio Asano in this. The majority of the story, we're following Punpun as he's navigating middle school and, you know, all of the territory that comes with that. The sense of existentialism you feel at that age, teenage angst, and that kind of teenage ennui, the awkwardness of going through puberty, but like also the humor in that. And it's obviously something that every person goes through, so it's kind of a universally relatable experience. And like, yeah, it was fine. Definitely didn't like it as much as Nijigahara Holograph, but this is a lot more slice of life. But it still has Inio Asano's kind of dark undercurrents, and again, that sense of existentialism and kind of like, what's the point of everything, you know? So I don't know if I'm gonna finish or move on with the series. I guess if you read this series, I know people who love this are like diehard fans, so some people might be disappointed to hear that I didn't love this, but I don't know. Let me know if I should continue on, if the rest of the volumes are a little bit better once he gets a little older. Just let me know. Okay, next I read a couple volumes from a series that I've been reading as it's been coming out. So that is Blood on the Tracks. So I read volumes 12 and 13. I've really talked about this quite a bit on my channel. So in brief, this is about a boy who is growing up with this really emotionally unstable mother. And the series really kicks off following this hiking trip with his family where his cousin falls and gets really badly hurt, and he's in a coma. So basically we're following this boy after that event and how he's navigating his family and specifically his relationship with his emotionally unstable mother. So this is a fantastic psychological thriller. If you like horror, even if you don't read manga, or if you've been interested or curious about getting into manga, please read this series because it is so good. Okay, next I read a kind of dystopian fiction or dystopian horror called And Then I Woke Up by Malcolm Devlin. This is about this kind of like plague or zombie type story, but I was really interested in this because the disease is one that warps your sense of reality. So that was really interesting to me, this idea of a plague where you might not actually know if you're infected or not, and even if you are, your concept of reality is so skewed. So very interesting to me. This was pretty good. I didn't like it as much as I was thinking I would, but I also thought it was very, very unique, and the writing style was really good, so I will definitely be reading more Malcolm Devlin. Plus, the cover is just gorgeous. So I think if you're even a little bit curious about this, you should really check this out. Next, I read another Inio Inio Asano called Downfall, and this is about a man who's a mangaka, and at the beginning of the book, he has just finished up one of his manga series. He's had a really good run of it, but he's kind of this yesterday's news type mangaka. While he does have a pretty big loyal fan base, people aren't really expecting a lot out of him, and we're following him sort of dealing with, even if you kind of like reach your dreams and do what you set out to do and what you think will make you happy, you're not guaranteed happiness. He's been this successful mangaka, and yet he's still so miserable. So for the majority of the book, we're following him as he sleeps with these call girls, and then he becomes infatuated with one of these call girls. At first I was like, oh, I kind of feel bad for this guy. And then the more you get to know him, it's like, oh, you're really not that good of a person. Obviously, if you're familiar with Inio Asano, he is just so good at writing the negative aspects of life and just getting it so right. I think the idea of pursuing your dreams and then kind of waiting for the day where you're going to finally feel happy and feel fulfilled, and then it just never comes. I think that that's something that is really relatable for a lot of people. Again, I didn't like it as much as Nijigahara Holograph. I think that's his magnum opus, but I did like it better than Goodnight Poon Poon. Next, I read I guess horror by Katrina Ward, and this was my first Katrina Ward. So I read The Last House on Needless Street, and I think this one, if you go in knowing as little as possible, it's probably for the best. But in short, we're following this guy who lives in his house, which was his family home, with his daughter and his cat. And there's this murder that happened like 10 or 15 years ago. The killer has never been found. So we're following mostly this guy who lives in this house, and then the sister of the girl who went missing. And she's convinced that he is the one who kidnapped and murdered her sister. So we're following both of these people, and I thought this was pretty good. This was pretty twisty-turny. I will say we sometimes get the point of view of the cat, and that was kind of weird to me. I'm a certified cat girly, okay? I have 3 cats. I love them. I would die for them. So it's not that I don't like cats, but I just think that her voice was very bizarre to me, and not in a believable way. Not in like, oh, it's because she's a cat. It was like, I don't like how this character is written. So didn't love the cat, but you know, this is a pretty good thriller. So I think if the synopsis is interesting to you, you should read it. Next, I read Dementia 21, Volume 1 by Shintaro Kago. This was my very first Shintaro Kago. As I mentioned previously, I'm really wanting to read more horror manga other than Junji Ito. Obviously, I love him. He's what got me into horror manga, and honestly, horror as a genre. But people like Shintaro Kago and Kazuo Umez, they were the ones who walked so Junji Ito could run. So I really want to read more of the earlier artists. So Shintaro Kago is known for his super surreal, oftentimes grotesque images. And what I really liked about Dementia 21 is that I wouldn't classify this as a horror necessarily. I think this is more speculative fiction. So we are following this home care nurse, and each story is like a standalone story where she's going to all of these different homes of these elderly folks and caring for them in various ways. And basically each person she cares for, or each story, there's this like wacko, bizarro thing that happens. Like one of the women that she cares for, it's kind of like this tongue-in-cheek nod to a dementia patient. And the sort of like horror of it is that when she forgets something, it like actually disappears from the world. So if she forgets a person, that person blips out of existence. So obviously that sets up a lot of potential funny scenes, but also like kind of scary, you know? I can definitely see how Junji Ito was influenced by an artist like Shintaro Kago. There's a lot of manipulation of the form, a lot of manipulation of the body. I'm definitely going to read more Shintaro Kago, and I'm planning to read the second volume of this series as well, because I thought it was a lot of fun. Next, for my June book club, we read We Spread by Ian Reid, and not to brag, but this was my pick. And this ended up being a really good book to read for a book club because there's so much to discuss about this book. So we follow this woman as she is getting older, and she's kind of struggling more and more to do things on her own. And one day she falls while she's like up on a chair trying to fix something, and then her landlord is like, okay, it's time for you to go to a care home. Don't worry, your late husband already arranged everything. And and she's pretty freaked out because she doesn't remember ever agreeing to this, but apparently she planned it with her husband. So then she gets to the facility, and at first she loves it. She really loves the other residents. She loves the really good food. She likes this sense of camaraderie, and like she finally has some peers, so it's a lot less lonely. But then the longer she's there, the more she feels like something is not quite right at this nursing home facility. If you've ever read any Ian Reid, he is so good at this really kind of creeping, dread-inducing prose. And the whole time, you're questioning, what is real? Is her memory just failing her because she's older? Is this the early stages of dementia? Are more sinister things happening at this home care facility? So the whole time, this book really keeps you guessing. And like I said, there's so much to unpack. And my book club only met for an hour, but I feel like we could have talked for a lot longer. So I really liked this. I definitely want to read more Ian Reid. Okay, next I read what I believe is the most disturbing book I have ever read, and that is Tampa by Alissa Nutting. I've talked about this a little bit on my channel so far, but in short, this is about a woman who trains to become an 8th grade teacher for the purpose of grooming and assaulting 8th grade boys. So very graphic. Obviously, abuse of a child. I think Alissa Nutting is such a gifted writer because have you ever read something where what's happening is so disturbing that you almost kind of feel like you're dissociating from reality, and there's this sense of unreality, and it's almost like your brain is trying to protect you. It's like, yeah, there's no way this could be real, because if it were, that would be too painful to actually process. It became so disturbing that it almost became absurd and funny, because it's like, how can you be saying stuff like this in this situation? So yeah, I think Alissa Nutting is such a gifted writer. This book was actually based on a true case and a true woman. After hearing that it was based on a real person, that just really repulsed me even more. Obviously, this is a very tough read. I would definitely tread with caution if you want to embark on this journey, but wow, one of the most disturbing books I've ever read, probably the most disturbing book. I talked a little bit more about it in my mid-year freakout tag, so you can check that out if you want to hear more of my thoughts, but whew, yeah, this is one that definitely will not be leaving me anytime soon. Okay, so I needed a little bit of a palate cleanser after Tampa. So I wanted to just have something kind of goofy, silly, fun, and I decided to read Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. So this is about a family who's at this Airbnb, chilling, they're relaxing, having a good time, and then suddenly they're like, oh, someone's at the door. And it's like this secluded cabin. And then they answer, and it's like this couple, and they're acting really dodgy. And they're like, hi, we're the owners of this house. We're the ones who rented this Airbnb out to you. And like, not to freak you out, but it seems like the world is kind of ending. So we wanted to get out of the city and kind of take refuge here until things calm down. At first, they're like, these people must be crazy and they're trying to extort us or like kill us or something. But then they realize there's no phone signal. Basically, everything has gone radio silent. So I feel like that premise and that setup is really cool and could be really gripping, but I just don't think I really like the writing style. Some of the lines were just really weird. Like there was one line where it was like the dad was naked outside and like watching the sunrise or like doing yoga or something. It just like kept referring to his penis. I feel like this scene wasn't necessary. I just don't think I really liked the voice that this author was infusing into this book, and the ending wasn't great, so I don't know. I didn't really like it. Okay, and then next, I was able to get the audiobook for Pageboy by Elliot Page. Was pretty excited because the audiobook is narrated by Elliot Page, and I've been a huge fan of his movies pretty much my whole life, so I was excited to hear about his life, and I knew it would be probably about his transition and the struggles and joys of that. And you know, it's really hard to review a memoir that's someone's life, so I just want to be very clear that I'm not critiquing the stories themselves, because obviously that's Elliot's life, that's his truth and what he went through. But as a book, I think that the narrative structure and how those stories were put together wasn't the most cohesive. And I love a non-linear timeline. I love jumping back and forth. I love when an author tells me something from this time and then we go back to this time, and it's very clear to me why they set it up that way. And unfortunately for a lot of Pageboy, it kind of just felt like these disjointed events in his life, the recurring theme throughout all of them was him coming to terms with his queer identity, coming to terms with his gender identity. And yeah, like obviously I'm not bagging on that at all. I'm like so happy for him. I'm so happy he's living his truth. But yeah, I think as a memoir, the structure and the way that the stories were put together didn't seem the most cohesive to me. But obviously it was still like super fun to read about Elliot Page and learn more about his life. So I don't want to deter anyone from reading this. Okay, next I read a folk horror novel that I had been really wanting to get to for so long. So that is Cunning Folk by Adam Nevill. So this is about this family who buys this house for really cheap, and they use all their money and all their savings, and they tie up all their money into this house. And they know going in that this man committed suicide in the house before finishing the house, so they know that they're getting a fixer-upper with some tragic history. This idea of a young family kind of getting stuck in this potentially haunted house is not a new one, but what's interesting about this is that the house has these old neighbors who from day one just seem super weird, and they start to have this tension with the neighbors. First it starts out with neighborly things like, oh, your tree branch is hanging over into my yard, or kind of just petty stuff. But then as the husband becomes more and more wrapped up in fixing up the house and fighting with the neighbors, things become more and more sinister. And it seems like there might be something more at play. But yeah, I think if you know me and you know what I like, you're gonna know what event happened that made me really like it. First Adam Nevill I've ever read, and let me tell you, this was kind of a tough one to get through. The first third to a half, I was like, man, I don't know. You know, I felt like I was fighting for my life. But this is one of those cases where I'm really glad I didn't DNF, because the last third to a half was really good. Honestly, this probably would have been a DNF for me, and it ended up being like a 4-star. It was like that meme where it was like, they had me in the first half, not gonna lie. Adam Nevill really needs to just shut the fuck up. Like with Peace and Love, some of this was so overwritten and I just needed it to be edited down. But I think that's kind of just his style. He has a very flowery, wordy prose, and if you're not a fan of that, you might not like this, but some dark and twisted things happen in this, and I think you should read it. Next, I read another horror manga by Kanako Inuki called Be Very Afraid of Kanako Inuki. So I had kind of seen this bouncing around on social media. The cover was kind of cool looking. Obviously, I want to support not only horror manga artists, but female horror manga artists. So I went into this really with high hopes, and while the art style was super cool, I feel like the stories weren't that compelling. This was a bunch of different short stories, and they didn't really leave that much of an impact on me. I definitely want to read more Kanako Inuki because I think her art style is really interesting. I don't know. I think if you're interested, you could pick it up because it's a really quick read, but for me, it wasn't what I really was wanting. Next, I read another new release called Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and I have really enjoyed the Eric LaRocca I've read in the past, but unfortunately, this wasn't a hit for me, and I think it's because it had too many fantastical elements. So this is about, what is this about even? I can't even really remember. So there's a lot of different characters too, and I love stories where we are introduced to different characters and they seem unrelated and then their paths cross. In this book, it didn't seem as successful. So this is about this small Connecticut town. We follow this widower who gets drawn into these dangerous rituals by this creepy old guy. A member of local law enforcement is like trying to figure out why all these old people have been disappearing. And then there's a huge subplot where he is being subjected to a bunch of homophobic violence against him and his husband. There were some like really graphic scenes too. So I would definitely look up trigger warnings of this. The really shocking scenes that were meant to be like so disturbing kind of came off a little gratuitous, and the concept of bigotry as a force of evil, I get that, but it just like wasn't the most successful in execution. Overall, I don't know, this just like wasn't that much of a hit for me. I didn't like it. I think if you want to read an Eric LaRocca, you should read We Can Never Leave This Place, which was again one of my best books of last year. Next, I read a graphic novel that looked really super cute called Girl Juice by Benji Nate. So we're following these 4 women who are all roommates. kind of like following the trials and tribulations of young 20-somethings. I just finished my 20s. You know, I get it. So I was wanting to read something fun, light, funny, relatable. But unfortunately, this wasn't a total hit for me because for the most part, we follow Bunny, and she's just really irresponsible, doesn't pay rent, makes all these impulsive decisions that don't end well, and I just really couldn't stand her. She kind of reminded me of Nana K from the anime and manga Nana, and Nana K is one of my least favorite characters in anything. I just think that those types of characters are so not people I can relate to. That's just not my energy at all. So she just kind of made me mad. I think that this art style was really cool, and this was very sex positive, very go women, which, like, yeah, I love that, but I just really hated Bunny. Next, I read Open Throat by Henry Hoke. This I listened to on audiobook, and I listened to it in one sitting because I was so enraptured by it. So this is about a gay mountain lion who lives under the Hollywood sign. The majority of the book is him making observations about people who pass by him in the park. We learn more about how climate change has affected his ability to survive, to find water, how he ended up living in this park. And yeah, this is really short, so I don't want to give too much away, but this was a freaking delight. One of the best books I've read so far this year. I loved this so much. This was so endearing, so fun, so poignant, funny, melancholy, and good. So you should read it. And then next I read Walking Practice by Dolki Min, translated by Victoria Caudle. And this is about an alien who crash landed on Earth and is unsure if their home planet is even still in existence, or any of their race or species. I guess I don't know what aliens use to denote themselves, but anyway, and in order to sustain themselves, they eat humans, but in order to make it a sustainable process, they use dating apps, and they are able to shapeshift into different forms and genders and body types in order to suit their match's preferences. So then they kind of go for a little booty call, and then they eat them. And it's really this meditation on feeling alien, obviously, in society, feeling other, feeling like you have so many boxes you have to fit into. A lot of this book is the alien describing how when they're shapeshifted into these different forms, they're so uncomfortable, and oftentimes it even reaches the point of pain because they're contorting themselves physically so much to fit into this mold of what they need to be in this moment. And obviously it's like really great commentary on our society in general and how people feel like there are so many different boxes they have to fit into, whether it's their gender or sexual identity, how young they look, how thin they look, how good their body looks, how they walk, how they talk, just like all of these things and all of these standards. So I really liked the commentary it was making, and there were a lot of like pretty humorous parts, and I did really like the ending, but I would say this was like 3.5 stars, and I still think you should read it. Next, I read Perfect Days by Rafael Montes, and this is about a med student in Brazil, and he meets this girl at a barbecue, and he becomes infatuated with her, and after she rejects him, he literally knocks her out, puts her in a suitcase, and then takes her on this trip, and basically like forces her to act as his like girlfriend, and like act like they're like on vacation together. And she is an artist and like a writer, so she's actually working on a screenplay, and the screenplay is about these friends who go on this road trip, and it's going to these places in Brazil. So he takes her to these different places in her screenplay. So while they're there, she's like writing her screenplay, and he even like has his family and her family convinced that they're actually dating. She really just like doesn't want to talk because she wants privacy because she's working on her screenplay. It's just like so freaking insanely gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. It's insane. So we're from the point of view of this med student who's clearly a psychopath. This was like so freaking good, so shocking, and this was very obviously influenced by Misery, this idea of becoming infatuated with a writer and then imprisoning them so that they can continue their writing in peace, you know, with a fan who loves them. It was just so disturbing how deluded this man was. He was so convinced that he was the perfect man for her, and like he loved loved her so purely, and it was her fault that she just didn't accept his love. She just didn't know what was good for her, that type of thing. So freaking disturbing. So I highly recommend this. I don't see anyone talking about this book. So I really think that this should be a booktube darling. This has something for everyone. This is like super freaking off the rails, cuckoo bananas disturbing, but still in an approachable way. Damn, yeah, you guys should read this. And then, as if we weren't getting disturbing and violent enough already, the final book that I read this month was Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West by Cormac McCarthy. So I had previously read No Country for Old Men by him and was pretty good. I could obviously see why he was such a revered writer. I'm happy to report that Blood Meridian I think was even better. This is one that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is about this gang of men. It's like a year after the Mexican-American War, and they basically go down into Mexico and are contracted by the Mexican government to headhunt Native Americans and bring back their scalps. And for every scalp that they bring back, they get a certain amount of money. So they're basically these hired mercenaries to go out and, commit genocide. What was so impactful about this book is how violent it was. This is probably the most violent book I've ever read. And the way that it's delivered is in such a nonchalant way. There are people slaughtered and children and infants slaughtered in this book. So definitely not for the faint of heart, but I think that that's so powerful because especially in Western media, we often romanticize the Wild West. You think of the pretty saloon girls and Clint Eastwood going out and he's the good guy and he's playing cards and he's a really good sharpshooter and he's a role model for everyone. But the reality is the majority of the Wild West was like these men. There was nothing governing them and they were literally just out raping, pillaging, slaughtering innocent people. So I think that if Cormac McCarthy were to hold back on that, it would have been a disservice to the story. I could obviously talk about this book for hours. Since reading this, I've watched so many YouTube videos kind of analyzing the book and specifically the character Judge Holden because he was a fascinating character to me. And there's actually a lecture series on it from Yale that you can watch on YouTube, and it's like a 2-part series. So I watched both of those. This is a book that as soon as I finished it, I was like, I don't think I liked that. And then each passing day, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, and it's to the point now where I feel like I'm kind of obsessing over it. I feel like I actually want to reread it. I want to buy a copy so I can annotate it because I think this is a book that could be discussed and analyzed for years and years and years. It is just that rich and layered. I think it truly is a masterpiece of fiction. I definitely understand why Cormac McCarthy is a literary titan. What a way to end the month. Okay, I have a pretty sad stack because a lot of what I read was from the library, but those are all the books that I read in May and June. I hope you guys liked this. I always love talking about the books that I read and love. You can like this video if you want, comment, subscribe if you want. I would love to have you. And let me know what you've been reading the last couple months. What have been your best and worst? And I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Okay guys, love you. See you next time. Bye.